Born into the heart of a royal dynasty, Margarita Teresa was cradled not by love, but by destiny's cruel hand. From her very first breath, her life was not her own. She was raised not as a daughter, not as a child, but as a pawn. Every smile, every lesson, every whispered prayer was tied to one terrible fate, that she would one day be given to her own uncle, forced into a marriage that was less about love, and more about blood. Imagine being a little girl, dressed in silks and jewels, while the truth of your future hung like a curse over your head. A princess adored by painters, immortalized on canvas, yet trapped in a cage of royal incest, betrayal, and decay. This is not the story of a princess who lived happily ever after. This is the story of Margarita Teresa, the child bride who was raised for ruin. The Habsburgs were not just a royal family, they were a machine of power, a dynasty that stretched its influence across nearly all of Europe. From the thrones of Spain and Austria, to the crowns of Hungary, Bohemia, and the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburg name became synonymous with empire itself. But their power came at a cost. A terrible, unnatural cost. Unlike other royal houses who secured alliances through distant marriages, the Habsburgs turned inward. They feared that by marrying outside their circle, they might lose control of their vast territories. And so, generation after generation, they married their cousins, their nieces, even their uncles. To them, this was not scandal, it was strategy. The result was a bloodline that grew thinner and weaker with each passing century. Children born sickly, fragile, sometimes unable to walk, or even to speak. Mouths twisted by the infamous Habsburg jaw, a deformity so grotesque it became a symbol of the family itself. By the 17th century, the Habsburg dynasty was less a story of glory, and more a story of decay. Historians today can trace the genetic collapse of the family through centuries of inbreeding. Cousin after cousin. Uncle after niece. Marriage after marriage, until their children carried the combined weight of too much sameness in their veins. It was not just blood they shared, it was disease, deformity, and death. And yet, inside the palaces of Madrid and Vienna, this was seen not as cruelty, but as necessity. Power had to be preserved, no matter the cost. A child was not a gift of love, but a pawn of empire. And so, when Margarita Teresa was born, she did not arrive into the world as an innocent baby in the eyes of her family. She arrived as an answer to a problem. A tool for survival. From her first cry, her fate was not her own. She was born of incest. And she was destined for it. This was the legacy she inherited, a dynasty built on blood, and ruined by it. In the heart of Madrid, within the towering walls of the Royal Alcazar, a child was born on July 12, 1651. The palace corridors echoed with both triumph and dread, for this infant would carry not just a crown, but a legacy of ruin. Her name, Margarita Teresa, daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his niece, Mariana of Austria. The royal bloodlines were already entangled. This child was the product of a dynasty that had long bound itself in incestuous alliances in the name of power. From her very first moments, there was no innocence. In the plush chambers, ministers and courtiers whispered about succession, about alliances, about blood. This newborn would not simply grow into royalty, she would have to become an instrument of dynastic survival. Her birth was celebrated with pageantry, the pomp, the processions, the brass trumpets, the incense burning before holy altars. Yet behind every decorative tapestry, behind every torchlit corridor, lay a tension darker than night. Would this child live? Would she be strong enough to weather the insidious decay already gnawing at her lineage? She was the eldest full sister of Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg king. But even at her birth, that title hung by a thread. Her younger brother would grow sickly, stunted, afflicted by the genetic burdens of generations of inbreeding. The court moved quickly to assign her roles. She was sent to learn etiquette, religion, languages, the arts, things that might mold her into a queen. But more than that, she was groomed to be a bride, not merely to any foreign prince, but to one within her own blood, preserving the union of Spanish and Austrian Habsburg houses. Portraits of her as a child, tiny, delicate, noble, would be painted and sent to the Viennese court, as proof of her beauty, her purity, her worth as a bride. A child born to privilege, yes. But also born to tragedy. In the glittering court salons, her name would be chanted as hope for dynastic continuity. In the hushed corners, courtiers already fretted whether her veins would bear the cost of consanguinity. As her infancy passed, she was surrounded, not by friends, but by ladies-in-waiting, tutors, priests, ambassadors. She would grow up in the echo of prophecy, that she would one day cross the Alps, wed an emperor, and carry the weight of dynasties on her slight shoulders. But for now, she was merely a child. A fragile spark in a rotting lineage. The House of Habsburg watched her, not as a daughter to be adored, but as a vessel of continuation, for better or worse. Margarita Teresa grew up in splendor, but it was splendor that suffocated. Her childhood home, the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, was a palace of shadows, vast halls hung with tapestries, corridors echoing with footsteps, chambers dimly lit by flickering candlelight. To outsiders, it was a fortress of majesty. To the little princess within, it was a cage. The Spanish court of the 17th century was unlike any other in Europe. Where the courts of France and Italy glittered with laughter, theater, and music, Madrid's court was rigid, suffocating, and ceremonial. Every movement was dictated by rules, every gesture weighed down by protocol. A princess could not simply walk through the gardens. She had to be escorted, observed, choreographed like an actor in a play she never auditioned for. Margarita was not raised by her parents in any normal sense. Like most royal children of her time, she was placed under the care of governesses, confessors, tutors, and ladies-in-waiting. Her father, Philip IV, was a distant figure, a weary king worn down by endless wars, economic collapse, and personal grief. Her mother, Mariana of Austria, was little more than a cold presence, whose sole duty was to secure heirs and enforce the dynasty's obsession with purity. For Margarita, affection was rare, but expectations were constant. Every day began with ritual, morning prayers, lessons in Latin, music, catechism, the practice of courtly manners. She was dressed not as a child but as a miniature queen, stiff bodices, heavy skirts, elaborate hairstyles that weighed down her head. Even in youth, her appearance was not her own. She was an ornament of the Habsburgs, displayed for admiration, but never free. Her portraits tell the truth more clearly than the court ever would. The painter Diego Velázquez, the great master of the Spanish Golden Age, captured Margarita again and again. In Las Meninas, she appears at the very center, a glowing child, surrounded by attendants, dogs, and dwarfs, all gazing upon her. To the viewer, she seems adored, radiant, the darling of the Spanish court. But look closer, and the image changes. The light that surrounds her isolates her. She is small, fragile, almost trapped within her dress. Even the servants around her look more alive, more free. Velázquez, perhaps unintentionally, revealed what the palace tried to hide: this child was both a jewel and a prisoner. While other children played in open fields, Margarita's days were bound by etiquette. While other girls could dream of their own futures, hers had already been decided. She was reminded constantly that she was not simply a daughter, nor a sister, she was a bride-in-waiting, destined for a marriage she did not yet understand, with a man she had never met. And though courtiers bowed before her, and portraits celebrated her, there was a silent truth in every corner of the Alcazar: Margarita Teresa belonged to the dynasty, not to herself. In a world where politics thrived on appearances, a young princess was never simply a child, she was a symbol. And for Margarita Teresa, that symbol was captured forever in paint. Her image was entrusted to the hands of one of Spain's greatest artists, Diego Velázquez, court painter to her father, King Philip IV. To the world, Velázquez's canvases were masterpieces of realism. To the Habsburgs, they were something else entirely: instruments of diplomacy, silent messengers of beauty and bloodline. From the moment Margarita could stand, she was posed before the easel. Stiff gowns swallowed her small frame, elaborate coiffures crowned her head, jewels glittered in her hair. Velázquez painted her again and again, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, sometimes at the center of courtly drama. Each brushstroke transformed her into something larger than herself, a delicate emblem of Spain's royal legacy. The most famous of these portraits is Los Meneses, 1656. There, Margarita is only 5 years old. She stands glowing at the center of the canvas, her wide eyes gazing outward, her small body engulfed in the heavy silk of her gown. Around her, dwarfs and maids fuss and flatter. In the background, her parents, the king and queen, are mere reflections in a mirror. But Margarita herself, the child, is unmistakably the focus. To the viewer, she seems almost divine, the axis of the entire court. Yet this was no innocent family portrait. It was a statement. A declaration of her importance, her value, her destiny. Even as a child, she was the dynasty's centerpiece. Other portraits, sent abroad to the court of Vienna, served a more sinister purpose. They were not keepsakes for her family. They were advertisements. Her painted likeness was shipped across borders as proof of her beauty, her health, her suitability as a bride. Each canvas was a silent proposal, whispering across Europe to her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. She did not know it then, but every time her image was carried across the Alps, her childhood was being sold piece by piece. Those rosy cheeks, those delicate hands, those solemn eyes, they were not merely her own features. They were currency, bargaining chips in the desperate marriage politics of her collapsing dynasty. Velázquez, with all his genius, may have known the truth. He painted Margarita with startling realism, not as an angel, but as a fragile child, stiff and weighted down by the finery of her station. In the folds of her gown, in the seriousness of her expression, one can glimpse something haunting, the quiet tragedy of a little girl dressed as a queen, paraded as an object of desire, and stripped of her chance to simply live. The world remembers these portraits as masterpieces. Few remember that behind each one was a child who never had the chance to choose how she was seen. From the moment her portraits crossed the Alps, Margarita Teresa's life was no longer her own. The gears of diplomacy and dynastic ambition turned inexorably, grinding her childhood into preparation for a fate already chosen. By 1659, when she was only 8, her father King Philip IV had already expressed his desire to offer his daughter to Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, as bride. The idea was not new. The Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburgs had long sought to bind themselves more tightly, preserving territory, influence, and legitimacy through intermarriage. But the negotiations would be long and careful. The court hesitated. The risk was enormous. Margarita was young. Her brother, Charles II, still lived, and the Spanish court feared that letting her go might complicate succession claims. Yet both Philip IV and Queen Mariana persisted in private correspondence, even with the nun Sor Maria de Agreda, that the marriage should be arranged. In 1662, the emperor accepted the offer and sent Count Potting to Madrid to begin formal negotiations. For months, negotiations twisted through contract terms, dowry, succession rights, and the wording of marital capitulations. On April 6, 1663, a betrothal was announced. The 12-year-old Margarita would be promised to her 23-year-old uncle and cousin, Leopold I. Still, the court delayed. Margarita was too young. The marriage contract was not finalized until December 18, 1663. Meanwhile, another portrait of the Infanta was sent to Vienna, a new proposal in paint, reinforcing her attractiveness, her youth, her compliance. Within the palace walls, Margarita's daily life changed subtly but irrevocably. Tutors sharpened her intellect. She studied languages, Latin, theology, etiquette, history. She was trained to read, to pray, to carry herself with dignity, not as a child, but as a possible empress. Her schooling was rigorous, her schedule precise. Under the watchful eyes of court functionaries, her demeanor was molded. At the same time, courtiers and diplomats whispered in shadowed corridors. They observed her health, her posture, her complexion. Every cough, every blush, every weakness was noticed. In the politics of royal marriage, beauty and vitality were weapons. A blemish could ruin an alliance. So her retinue guarded her, but also monitored her. She was a prized object, but also a fragile one. When King Philip IV died on September 17, 1665, the kingdom felt the tremors of uncertainty. His will had already mentioned Margarita's marriage, stipulating that if her brother died, she and her husband would inherit Spain, with her mother as regent. After the king's death, Queen Mariana pressed ministers to confirm the marriage to Leopold. Still, the move was delicate. Margarita was heir in contingency. For decades, Spain had been engaged in one war after another, conflicts in the Spanish Netherlands, entanglements with France, struggles to maintain control in Italy, and perpetual involvement in European diplomacy. These constant military campaigns drained the royal coffers, pushing the crown ever deeper into debt. Historians note that Spain's overextension in war was one of the fundamental causes of its decline. The monarchy's response was predictable but destructive: forced loans, repeated borrowing from foreign bankers, and defaults. Spain declared bankruptcy multiple times in the 17th century, weakening its financial credibility abroad and crippling its ability to respond to crises. Meanwhile, the empire's far-flung possessions became harder to maintain. The Spanish crown struggled to govern its American colonies, and with declining revenues from the Americas, the burden of sustaining armies, ships, and bureaucracies fell increasingly on Spain itself. The result, a monarchy that was overstretched, underfunded, and increasingly fragile. One of Spain's greatest paradoxes was the very source of its initial might, the silver and gold flowing from the Americas. That influx of precious metal should have been a blessing. Instead, it became a curse. Spanish policymakers had little industry to absorb the flood of wealth. Instead of investing in modern manufactories or infrastructure, Spain grew more dependent on imports for manufactured goods. The foreign silver inflated prices at home, eroding the competitiveness of domestic production. The money supply ballooned. As coinage flooded the market, inflation soared. Wages and agricultural prices could not keep pace. Middle and lower classes suffered most. The nobility and clergy, often exempt from taxation, were less affected. Economists and thinkers in Spain, the so-called arbitristas, warned about the madness of relying on silver alone, lamenting that the kingdom had become a republic of enchanted men, seeking wealth and treasure rather than labor and innovation. Thus, what should have been the foundation of greatness became the poison of dependency. Spain's tax system was deeply flawed. It leaned heavily on regressive indirect taxes, the alcabala, sales tax, and the millons, which fell disproportionately on ordinary people. Meanwhile, wealthier classes, nobles, church institutions, military orders, enjoyed privileges and exemptions. The crown lacked the political will or capacity to break these privileges. The people bore the brunt. When revenues fell short, the monarchy resorted to extraordinary measures: forced loans, sequestrations, emergency assessments. But those moves only undermined confidence. Provinces and local elites resisted. Fiscally, Spain teetered on collapse. By mid-17th century, Spain was caught in a feedback loop. Debts demanded more borrowing, which led to defaults, which led to reduced credit, which led to further recourse to extractive taxation, diminishing returns all around. Spain's internal cohesion, already delicate, began to fray. In 1640, Portugal rebelled and regained its independence after 60 years under the Spanish crown, a bitter blow to Spanish pride and resources. Catalonia and Aragon also grew restless. The monarchy was forced to navigate regional privileges and growing resentment of central control. Meanwhile, France pressed its advantage. Under Louis XIV, France was ascending. Spain's military defeats in battles like Rocroi, 1643, undermined the aura of invincibility. By the time Margarita Teresa came of age, Spain's dominion over its European possessions was weakened. Provinces were distant, cut off, or practically autonomous. Madrid's shadow was shrinking. Worse still, Spain's population stagnated. The 17th century saw waves of disease, famine, and emigration. Plague outbreaks, like the Great Plague of Seville, 1647 to 1652, killed tens of thousands across Andalusia and beyond. Famines and poor harvests periodically struck, further weakening the rural base. Many farmers abandoned lands, or could not invest in improvements. Agricultural productivity lagged. As the labor pool shrank, wages rose, tempting landlords to sell estates or lease less land. Spain's rural economy, once resilient, was now brittle. Contemporary commentators, the arbitristas, linked depopulation to decline, fewer men to fight, fewer souls to tax, fewer bodies to sustain the economy. In short, Spain's fields turned hollow, its towns grew stagnant, its people hollowed out by plague and poverty. All this decay took place behind gilded curtains, inside palaces that pretended strength. The court in Madrid carried on as if nothing had changed. The nobles paraded, ceremonies continued, alliances were still made. But they were illusions covering rot. For Margarita Teresa's generation, these cracks were everywhere, though many courtiers refused to see them. Her marriage to Leopold was partly a desperate bid to prop up Spain's faltering house. When her father, Philip IV, died in 1665, he left a broken kingdom to his young heir, Charles II, and a daughter whose marriage carried as much weight as any army. The dynasty's survival, in many eyes, depended not on swords or strategy, but on the success of that union. She was sent away to Vienna not as a choice, but as a sacrifice. Her beauty, her bloodline, her obedience were all deployed as tools to preserve what remained of Spanish power in a Europe that was passing Spain by. By the time Margarita Teresa reached adulthood, Spain was no longer the dominant force of her ancestors. It was a kingdom in decline, wounded, indebted, hollowed, and desperately clinging to dignity even as the foundations crumbled beneath it. She had been raised to be an empress. Groomed to hold dynasties together. Painted as an angel, adored as a jewel. But behind the silks and ceremonies, Margarita Teresa was dying, slowly, painfully, and silently. Her short life in Vienna was not one of triumph. It was one of sacrifice. And like so many Habsburgs before her, she paid with her body, her spirit, and her youth. From the day Margarita Teresa arrived in Vienna, her health faltered. She was delicate, small, and weary, her body strained by the harsh winters of Austria and the demands of her role. Pregnancy after pregnancy consumed what little strength she had. Between the ages of 16 and 21, she endured 6 pregnancies. Only a few of her children survived infancy. Each birth drained her, leaving her weaker, thinner, and more prone to illness. Physicians of the time prescribed prayers, relics, purges, and tonics, but no remedy could change the truth. Margarita was not built to bear the weight placed upon her. Her body had been broken before it had ever matured. Her life was one of constant ceremony. Even when her health began to fail, the court demanded appearances, banquets, audiences, processions. She was forced to endure heavy gowns, jewels, hours of standing, endless bows and curtsies, all while racked with fatigue. Behind closed doors, she suffered quietly. Letters suggest she endured fevers, headaches, swelling, weakness. But in public, she was expected to smile. An empress could not look ill. An empress could not collapse. An empress could not show her suffering. Vienna became her prison. Gold walls and marble floors were nothing but cages for a girl who had never been allowed to live freely. For all her status, Margarita Teresa was desperately lonely. Her mother remained in Madrid. Her brother Charles II, frail and sickly, could not visit. She was surrounded by courtiers, but few were companions. Leopold, her husband, was not unkind, but he was consumed with affairs of state, war, and religion. He saw in Margarita not a wife to love, but a vessel of duty. She was praised when she conceived, pitied when she miscarried, and forgotten when she was ill. In her loneliness, Margarita often wrote to her mother, begging for consolation. But letters were slow, censored, and sometimes never reached their destination. She had left Spain with tears, and in Vienna, those tears never truly stopped. Everywhere she turned, she was reminded of her bloodline, a dynasty so obsessed with purity that it destroyed itself. The Habsburg chin, the genetic disorders, the infertility, the premature deaths, all were the visible price of centuries of inbreeding. Her own marriage, to her uncle, was the most extreme example. And it was killing her. The very union meant to preserve the dynasty was the one that weakened it further, producing children as frail as their mother, unable to carry the line with strength. The Habsburg dynasty demanded loyalty. Margarita gave it. And it consumed her. By 1673, Margarita was only 21 years old. But she looked far older. She was frail, pale, and often bedridden. Her body had been devastated by repeated childbirth, miscarriages, and infections. In the spring of that year, her condition worsened. Chronic illness overtook her, perhaps an infection from childbirth, perhaps exhaustion compounded by her weak constitution. Physicians tried their remedies, bloodletting, purges, holy relics. Nothing worked. As her health slipped away, Vienna grew hushed. Courtiers whispered of her weakness. Priests urged her to confess and prepare for death. And Margarita herself, still so young, still barely more than a girl, faced the truth: her life was ending. On March 12, 1673, Empress Margarita Teresa of Spain died. She was 21. Her death sent ripples of grief through Vienna and Madrid alike. But the grief was not purely personal. It was political. With her passing, Spain lost one of its last hopes for dynastic survival. Leopold lost his empress, but more importantly, he lost the bridge that tied the Austrian and Spanish branches of the Habsburgs. Her body was buried with ceremony, her soul entrusted to heaven. But her story, her suffering, was quickly swept aside by the machinery of dynastic necessity. Leopold remarried. Charles II struggled on in Spain. The Habsburgs endured, though weaker with every generation. And Margarita Teresa, the girl painted by Velázquez, the angel of Madrid, the bride of Vienna, faded into the shadows of history. She was born into a dynasty obsessed with itself. Raised not for love, but for sacrifice. Married not for joy, but for blood. And she died before she ever truly lived. The world remembers her face, framed in velvet, glowing on canvas, immortal in portraits. But her life was no masterpiece. It was a tragedy. The slow death of an empress who was, from the very beginning, doomed.